royal house of Valois was the reigning monarchical house of France from the year 1328 to 1589. They didn't have the raw divine pomp and pageantry of their successors, the Bourbons. They didn't have the almost global conquest and European hegemony of Napoleon. And they certainly didn't have the high-minded ideals and brutal reality of the Revolution. But without them, none of the above would have been possible. So I ask that you join me, Sumatricus, as we explore their entire history across the course of centuries. Together, we shall delve into an often ignored section of French history. We shall explore how they came to power when no one, they themselves included, thought they would. We shall see how they grappled with the English in over 100 years of dynastic war. We shall study how their reforms set the groundwork for France to become a superpower, and we shall understand how they played the great game of politics, war, and nation building. This is the House of Valois. Hello and welcome back, my knights, my viscounts, and my marquesses, to episode 2 of the House of Valois. Now, before we get stuck in, I have one correction to make for last episode. I incorrectly referred to the Plantagenets as the Kings of France. That's a rookie mistake, and they have never been the Kings of France, even though they did get kind of close, but we'll get there when we get there, right? So with that out of the way, let's get stuck in. Where we last left off, Philip VI and Edward III had just begun the 100 Years' War. And when this all began, France was large and in charge. It had more people and it had more cash. This is also during the tenure of the Avignon papacy, meaning that our boy Philip can deploy more religious influence than Edward can. Now, I hear you asking, what is the Avignon papacy? So, to explain this, we have to go back to Philip IV. He did his standard political moving and shaking and forced the papacy, beginning with Clement V, to move to the papal conclave of Avignon in 1309. This was the state of play for the next 67 years, and the absence of the papacy from Rome is sometimes referred to as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy, in reference to when the Jewish peoples were held captive in Babylon. But, to return back to Philip VI, France was at the zenith of its medieval power at the beginning of the war. It was the big dog. Even though, as I mentioned in last episode, there's no such thing as a centralized government, it was still a hell of a lot more centralized than the Holy Roman Empire. It had vast tracts of land, it had vast wealth to draw from, and it really was the bee's knees. So in the opening phase of the war, French privateers raided and burned towns and shipping all along the southern and southern-eastern coast of England. The English retaliated with some raids into France and burned down a fleet at Boulogne-sur-Mer, but so far, nothing too crazy has happened as of yet. In 1339, Philip gave orders for a fleet to be assembled off the coast of Zeeland at Sluis. Sluis or Sluis, depending on whether you're speaking French or Dutch. Now, Zeeland is on the border of the modern-day Netherlands and Belgium, for those of you who would like a cheeky geographic reference point. In June 1340, the Battle of Sluis occurred and resulted in an English victory. The English attacked the port and destroyed the ships and ended the threat of a French invasion of the English mainland. Now, even if this fleet hadn't have been destroyed, there is no guarantee that Philip would have been able to even get to the English mainland. The English Channel is notoriously fickle for its weather. It is a violent section of sea. For example, previously, William the Conqueror had to wait weeks for the wind to turn and was even close to abandoning his attempted invasion of England at that point because the weather was so fickle. Further on in the future, we have the Spanish Armada and their attempt to get into the English mainland, and also having to deal with the violent storms that occur in the English Channel. But to return to the 100 Years' War, on land, Edward III focused his attacks on Flanders and the Low Countries where he had gained allies through careful diplomacy and bribes. As you recall me mentioning in the first episode, the Low Countries, Flanders, the Netherlands, Holland, Belgium, these places are a hotbed for conquest. There is a lot of proxy warfare happening. There are people who are supported by France, there are people who are supported by England, and later on there'll be people who are supported by the Holy Roman Empire, and so many factions get involved in this place. So normally they'll all be fighting for their own little piece of power, and when they get it, they will bequeath that power and influence to their master, whether their master be the King of England or the King of France. Now, Philip did not engage with these raids because he knew that Edward had an Achilles heel. The Achilles heel that has afflicted every human since the dawn of time and still afflicts us today: lacking cash. Edward did not have the economic ability to sustain war for a long period of time. So Philip won the game by deciding not to play. In July 1340, Edward was able to collect a bit more cash via a new tax on grain and wool. Now, even though Edward thought this would get him a big bag, it did not. He thought it would collect for him £100,000, but he only netted £15,000 out of this new tax. So even though he's generated what I'm sure would be inflated to billions of dollars today, it's still not much. I mean, war is expensive. These kings are taking out massive loans to fund this stuff. And if you're not taking out massive loans, you're probably bankrupting every single gold coin that you have out of your treasury for a war. So even though this is a matter of national honour, a matter of national pride, and especially for the royals that are involved, it does really depend on you winning. Otherwise, you're going to lose a hell of a lot. Excuse me. Now, Edward returned to the continent all the same and split his army, giving a large portion to Robert of Artois, our favourite French traitorous noble mentioned in the first episode, and he took the rest of his own army to lay siege to the city of Tournai. Edward's own forces were bolstered by his Flemish allies, the forces of William II, Count of Hainaut, and men from the Holy Roman Empire sent by Emperor Louis IV. Now, Hainaut is an ancient principality that no longer exists. It sort of sits in that awkward intersection between Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France, for those of you who wanted a second geographic reference. As I said in the first episode, the Low Countries are super important, and the 100 Years' War does not disappoint. The Siege of Tournai, interestingly enough, and this is something I didn't know until I did research for this episode, was actually one of the first times that cannons were used in siege warfare. Now, I had thought that the first time cannons had come into play was at the Siege of Constantinople, when the Ottoman Turks attacked with the guns of Urban, but I was wrong. They were apparently already in play a couple of hundred years before that point. Now, you would think with cannons, they're pretty modern artillery, they're, pretty big bickies, that they'd be able to get through the walls of Tournai, but you would be wrong, my friend. These walls were cutting-edge medieval technology. So, Edward had to resort to a tried-and-true classic method, starving out the city. That's how the ancient Persians did it, that's how the ancient Greeks did it, that's how the ancient Romans did it, and it's worked pretty well so far. So, Edward decided to deploy the classic technique. But by September, Edward had run out of cash. He could no longer afford to pay or feed his troops, and because of this, he was open to talking this out. Now, it's important to realise that an army runs on its stomach. If you can't pay for these men to be there, then they ain't going to be there. And especially considering this is a coalition force, all of these continental soldiers are just going to leave. They're just going to go back to their homes, maybe do a bit of raiding on the way, and they'll still break even on the whole thing. So, Philip was persuaded at this point to send his sister Joan of Valois, who was Count William's mum, to discuss terms with Edward, which led to a 9-month truce. Here is where we really get into the Game of Thronesy nature of this whole thing, right? I mean, Philip is sending his sister, who is the mother of one of his enemies, to go talk to his second cousin to try and engineer a peace treaty, right? I mean, these guys are inbreeding all over the shop over here. Far for us to be surprised by that in the medieval ages. So far, the war had gone in Philip's favour. He and his men had successfully deployed a Fabian strategy against a debt-riddled Edward. What is a Fabian strategy? I hear you asking, my loyal listener. A Fabian strategy is where pitched battles are avoided in favour of wearing one's enemy down. It was popularised by Quintus Fabius Maximus, who pioneered this strategy against Hannibal during the Second Punic War. Now, I did find a bit of a fun quote referring to Philip during my research. The quote goes like this: "While often stereotyped as chivalry besotted incompetence, Philip was actually doing a good job," which I thought was a funny turn of phrase. In fact, Philip had smartly resisted all calls for chivalric deeds. He resisted calls for single combat, he had resisted calls for pitched battles of knights, and rightly so. Why would you get involved in doing something silly like that when you have got the King of England by the balls and you're about to take Aquitaine, the jewel of the South? I mean, come on, Phil, you got this locked down. At the same time as this truce had occurred, there was an outbreak of war in Brittany, the Breton Succession War. Excuse me. Now, this war did allow for the English to garrison troops on the peninsula, but Philip was still in a leading position. Brittany, for those of you who don't know, is the peninsula that rides out from the west of France. It was nominally a subject of the French crown, but had been prone to swapping sides. In 1344, Edward and Philip came together to discuss negotiations arbitrated by Pope Clement VI, in which Edward offered to end the war in exchange for Philip returning the Duchy of Aquitaine to him. Philip declined, and at this point, I can see why. I mean, it looks like he's going to win this, right? In the next stage of the war, which came in 1345, the Earl of Derby was able to capture the area of Angoulême, which is an ancient region in France which had existed before the conquest of Julius Caesar. It is now south of the modern region of Périgord. So this is a pretty big deal. I mean, we're talking about, this is original Gaulish territory, right? So for the Earl to capture this, it's a pretty big deal. Now, during this attack, the Earl took the city of Angoulême. At the same time, forces under Sir Thomas Dagworth also made gains in Brittany. In response, in 1346, the French launched a massive counterattack against Aquitaine, where an army under John, Duke of Normandy, besieged the Earl of Derby at Angoulême. Now, even though Philip had proclaimed the duchy forfeited, the reality was it still did belong to Edward. Edward was keen to sail to Aquitaine, but on the advice of Godfrey Harcourt, another banished French nobleman, Edward had decided to attack Normandy instead. Now, our boy Edward made the right decision because he took the French completely unawares and caught the duchy devoid of all men of fighting age and any real defence. Edward burned and raided the country, and before Philip could respond, he slipped across the River Somme and set himself up at Crécy. Philip had attempted to raise an army in Paris while Edward had been gallivanting around, but was unable to marshal them in time, so he decided instead to give chase to Edward. Hot on his trail, Philip had planned to stop for the night and take the opportunity to scout the land around Crécy, but all the roads were jammed by the tail end of his own army and French peasants viciously demanding revenge against the English for their crimes in Normandy. Having begun to lose control of his army, Philip sent them forward to attack Edward and set off the famous Battle of Crécy. Any of my listeners who are big fans of the 100 Years' War, you are sure to have heard of this. So, let's set the scene for this battle. The French massively outnumbered the English, right? I mean, it's home ground advantage, right? But the whole French attack was rushed, and it was undisciplined, and there was not much order to it at all, which is not what you want. You need discipline in your army. That is absolutely crucial. The army was composed of a lot of mercenary bands. It was also composed of a lot of unexperienced and unprofessional peasants. So it's not looking good. Even though you got the high numbers, the little bit of quantity over quality seems to be in play here. Now, the English had dug massive pits, and also the field of battle was sodden with mud. As the battle began, English longbowmen were able to dominate the field. This is where they really proved themselves to be the Mac Daddy of range combat at this point in time, right? They were so good at range combat, they were actually able to fend off an attack from a mercenary band of the French army using crossbows. Not only did they do this, but they were able to decimate French cavalry in their disordered charges, and they were able to thin out French foot soldiers so much that by the time the French charges finally reached the English lines, the combat was described as murderous, without pity, cruel, and very horrible. The French army was annihilated, and Philip himself was wounded, only barely able to escape with his life. Now, you might recall me mentioning in the first episode that if Philip had been captured, that would have been it. These guys live and die by this single battle, right? If he had been captured, that would have been it. Aquitaine would have been restored to Edward. Edward would have demanded probably the GDP of France for at least 5 years, or at least the entire GDP of Philip's crown lands, and it would have been game over, right? Now, following their victory, the English pressed the advantage and mounted a siege on the nearby city of Calais. And even though the town held out stubbornly, the English were easily supplied by Calais being so close to the English Channel. They were easily able to get people to load up ships for them in London, send them over, and they were sorted for the long haul. At the same time, Sir Thomas Dagworth was able to capture Charles of Blois, harming the French cause in Brittany. In July 1337, Philip led a relief force, but this time Edward had the upper hand. Having plundered Normandy and reformed his own tax system, he could hold to his siege lines and wait for Philip. Now, this, of course, plays exactly into the English strengths. He's going to be able to set up his longbowmen. He's going to have his men-at-arms in front of his longbowmen, defending them. And after the massive defeat that Philip suffered at the hands of these longbowmen, he's not going to be eager to engage with an entrenched position of them. And that's exactly what happened. Philip dared not attack, and in August, he marched away. Having seen this, the citizens of Calais lost all faith, and they knew that their time was up, so they capitulated soon after Philip's retreat. After his defeats at Calais and Crécy, the Estates of France refused to raise money for Philip, halting his plans for a counterattack by invading England. So that was it, right? Philip no longer has the trust of his own people. His nobles, though still in support of him, are starting to see the writing on the wall at this point in time. And something a lot worse is coming, right? Excuse me, I believe I said July 1337. That's meant to be July 1347. Now, in 1348, the Black Death strikes France, right? The Big Mac Daddy, the big dog, the one unit in the whole world that has the highest Call of Duty kill count of all time comes into France, right? The Black Death kills 1/3 of the population, including Philip's wife at the time. The resulting labour shortage caused inflation to skyrocket. Philip responds by trying to fix prices, but this only further destabilises the country. The Black Death is so deadly that it is the single event that defines human evolution for the remainder of our history. If you do some research, you will find that our DNA has been fundamentally altered by this disease. That is how bad it was, right? Philip, you would think, might want to take some time to collect himself to figure out his next move. He does the one thing that you would never think to do, and he decides to steal his son's wife. Bit of a bold move. I personally probably wouldn't have gone in and stolen my son's fiancée, but yeah, look, I guess the man's been through a lot. He needs some loving. So he steals his son's wife. They were betrothed at the time. Philip undoes this and has her marry him. This alienates all of the nobles. You know, you don't do this. You don't do this in 2023, and you don't do this in 1349, right? It's the eternal law. So now Philip's not only lost the support of the common people, he's lost the support of the nobles, and he's even lost the support of his own family. Philip's last great act was the acquisition of the Dauphine region and the territory of Montpellier in 1349. This was his last great achievement. And on the 22nd of August, 1350, Philip finally died. When he died, he was buried with his first wife, and Philip left France a divided nation which was in the midst of a dynastic war, the likes of which Europe had not seen since the great civil wars of the Roman Empire. Philip's son, John, would succeed him. So, that's it for episode 2. We've finally finished up on Philip. Next week, we will get stuck into John, and we'll continue with the 100 Years' War under his tenure. This one's been a pretty crazy episode. You know, the French were large and in charge, and then they lost it all. I mean, it's not how I thought it would go, but as we know from the modern maps, the French are going to get it all back. So let's see how they begin this recovery, or at least try to break even with John in our next episode. And until then, keep fighting your chivalric wars, keep fighting honor duels, and always remember to keep exploring your history. I've been Symmetricus, and I will see you next time. Thank you.